All right, if you recall last time, we were going to go over the final part of the example that we did. So let's bring up the example and review where we were at and finish it up. This example, we have drop down for the type of employee they are, and their wage rate is depending on the type of employee they are. In addition, whether they get overtime or not is dependent on their job type. So we type in the number of hours, the type of employee they are, and we can calculate their gross pay. And we get this gigantic check mark saying that everything's okay. I corrected that last time, but I did not re-upload it. So change this because it's annoying. All right, so we'll enter in number of hours, and we get a check saying everything was valid. If we enter in something that's invalid, such as letters for the number of hours, we get an X. And we get added to an unordered list rather, an error message saying exactly what's wrong. If we have more than one, we get more than one item added to the list. I think we've gone over everything, the validation, the calculation. The last thing that we had to go over was the displaying of the image. So let's take a look at this. All right. If you remember, the process form decides if the form is valid or not by calling the isValidate function. That is a Boolean function, so it's going to return either a true or false. And therefore, if the validate form is true, that means everything's okay. Calculate results. If it's not valid, we display this image. So we were going to either display the valid or invalid image, depending on whether it was valid data entered or invalid data entered. So we call this function called display image. And it has two arguments, the actual file name of the image and the alt attribute for the image. So this is a different way to create HTML than what we did with the unordered list. With the unordered list, we simply created a big string and concatenated different HTML tags into that string. And if there was errors, we simply set the inner HTML. A better way to do it is this way, because this allows us to create objects, keep track of objects, and so on. So what we're doing here, first of all, is we're creating an image object. All right. Now, we said before the DOM stands for Document Object Model. Everything on the page is represented by an object in code. All right, and Document Object Model allows us to access and manipulate the different objects on the page. So at this point, we're creating a brand new object, and that object is an image tag. All right, so we're creating an image. Right now, that image does not appear. By right now, I mean when this instruction is executed, that image is not placed on the page yet. So that image object is just sort of floating in space, floating in memory, waiting for us to do something with it. We can then set attributes of it this way. Our object, set attribute, we can set the src attribute to the file name. The alt object to the alt property to the argument attribute. So right now we have this in memory. Just open up a brand new thing. Right now we have this in memory. We have an image tag that's in memory, but it's not placed on the page yet. All right. What we're going to do is we're going to place it in this location on the page called graphic. So if we come down here, graphic is this section down here. Initially, it starts out with nothing in it. Now, in proper document object model terminology, this node or this tag has no children, or that is, it doesn't contain any tags nested within it. So there's no child nodes inside this graphic initially. All right. So the first thing we do is we get a pointer to it. We point to that object. Remember, we still have that image tag floating in space, and it's referenced by the variable name image. IMG, that is. So in memory, referenced by the name IMG is this image tag. We find the place on the page that we want to put it. So we find the location of where we want to put the tag. We then execute this code. And this code is going to loop through and remove every child from the result section or the graphic section. So remember, I said the terminology child is sort of a sub tag, a tag that's nested within that tag. Initially, there's nothing in there. So therefore, this loop doesn't have a first child. This loop doesn't have that location doesn't have a first child. So we actually don't even execute the body of this loop. All right. This will come in the second time through so that when we enter some data, we get rid of that old image and put a new image in there. All right. So this code is really only run each subsequent time, because initially, as I pointed out, that graphic tag, that section with an ID of graphic, doesn't have any children underneath it. Now I could put something in there. can put that in there, and when we enter something in, that text disappears. Why? Because now this does have a child. That paragraph tag is said to be the child of graphic in that graphic ID section. And we remove it. We do this as long as there are children in that tag. So the first time through the loop, it's going to remove that paragraph. The second time through the loop, if there was a second paragraph, it would remove that too. So that loops through as long as there are children left in that section with an ID of graphic. It's going to loop through and it's going to remove those children. That's what this loop says. This will return a false. This returns one of two things. This either returns a false or it returns a pointer to the child object. So in our case, the first time through the loop, it returns a pointer to the first paragraphed object. The second time through the loop, it returns a pointer to the second object in the loop. Because we've deleted the first child, the second child now becomes the first child. And we do that over and over again until there's nothing left. However, if there's no children in there, this will return a false. That's kind of an unusual aspect of JavaScript, all right? We're returning two different types of data depending on the situation. We're either returning a false or we're returning an element. If there's an element there, it returns the first one. If there's no elements there, it returns a false. So as soon as there are no elements there, we drop out of this loop. This code, by the way, will be needed in your assignment 4, because one thing that you want to do before you display the coins, you want to delete everything that was in the results before. So if I picked 4 dimes the first time through, I want to display those 4 dimes. If I then pick 5 nickels, I want to wipe out the 4 dimes that I displayed and display the 5 nickels. All right. Then I go and actually put it somewhere on the page. That image tag, remember we had it over here on the back burner, floating in memory. We actually say add that child or append that child to this element location, which is the section of the page that has an ID of graphic. So we append. Append means add to the end. So right now, at this point, there's only ever going to be one image in here because we're not looping through. All right. We're getting rid of everything and then adding the one image. Now, the other thing we do is notice we have a word displayed, whether the image, whether the data was valid or not. We do that by creating a text node. So I'm going to take my alt attribute and I'm going to display it here as well, in addition to being the alt attribute of this image tag. So I set my message to the alt attribute that was passed in as an argument. I create a text node which just is going to contain text. And I set the text in the text node to the message variable, and then I append that child. So I lied. There's actually two children in here the second time through. There's one image and one text node. Now, how does this apply to your assignment? Well, we said that each time through, you're going to want to clear things out before you start adding the new coins. The difference is that here we're creating a single image and adding it. In your example, you're going to have a loop that's going to go and create image after image a certain number of times and then add it. So essentially, you're going to wrap some of this code and some of this code in a loop that's going to execute a certain number of times. And that will have the effect of adding multiple images of the same image name to that section. So these lines and these lines are going to be in a loop that's going to execute however many coins was chosen. Any questions about this approach? This approach, again, is better than just doing the inner HTML. Let me ask ChatGPT what it thinks about it. That's not ChatGPT, or is it? Was. Oh, I see. A while since I logged into this account. Oh, I have no idea what's going wrong with this. Oh, I logged in that way. I should have clicked continue with Google. Okay, and it's going to ask my phone if it's okay. Yes, it's me. Okay. When creating HTML via JavaScript, is it better to set inner HTML or create objects, create end objects? Okay, good Summarize better than I can. If you can read this, inner HTML is simple, but simple isn't always better. Sometimes there can be better performance. However, there's a security risk using inner HTML. And it overwrites content, which you might not always want to do, right? If you set the inner HTML. Creating and appending objects, more control. You have finer control over individual elements and their attributes. It's safer than inner HTML, creating the objects. And preserve event listeners. You can retain event listeners attached to existing elements. And it's a little more complex and it might be a little slower. And their suggestion is for larger things, better to create and append objects. So overall, I think other than for some very quick and dirty stuff, it's better to create and append the objects via JavaScript. All right. Any questions over this? All right, let's look at the next example. And the next example, well, we'll see it when we get there. I could put in a background color and a foreground color and change the color. And it will change the color scheme of that to whatever it is. And it writes out to this unordered list a message saying the background color, what I change it to, the foreground color. If I say background color of it'll change it, and so on down the line. We can do this as many times as we want. And finally, we can clear history. All right. So let's dive into this. The first thing about this is we are going to attach our JavaScript to the HTML differently. And all the examples we've gone over so far, we've simply had put user events associated with the JavaScript, associated with the HTML objects to trigger the JavaScript. For example, here on our button, we have an on-click event. All right, an on-click event. Is that wrong? No, it's not wrong. Is it preferred? Probably not. And here's why. If you remember back when you studied cascading style sheets, you wanted a very clean separation between the style sheet code and the HTML code. In other words, if we wanted to set the style for this, we wouldn't go style equals and put in our style there. We can do that. We're allowed to do that, but we're not going to do that. Why? Well, because it's better to put it in a cascading style sheet file, because then you can easily reuse it on other pages without having to mess with the HTML. All right. So we're taking the same principle here. We're going to connect JavaScript to the HTML using JavaScript itself. All right. And here's how we do that. Now notice that this first line of code here is outside of any function. Okay, it's not contained in a function. What this is going to do is this is going to set an event. We're giving it a function name to execute when the page is finished loading. All right. So everything in this page load event or page load function All those things get executed when the page initially loads. Let me rephrase that. It gets executed when the page is finished loading. And that's important to do, right? Because if we had JavaScript here, this stuff hasn't been loaded yet. The browser is sort of a one-pass thing. It goes from beginning to end. So therefore, if you have code, JavaScript code here that refers to something down here, it's not going to work because this hasn't been, these objects haven't been created yet. That's why a lot of people, instead of doing the Windows on load event, will put their JavaScript on the bottom of the page because that guarantees that the HTML, all the HTML elements have been loaded. I prefer this way, to set a page load event, and that's what this does. This says when the window, page in the window finishes loading, execute this function. So the alternate way to do that would be to put an onload method, onload equals here. That's the old style that we could have done it that way. But again, the better new and improved style is to create the onload event this way. Okay, so when the page finishes loading, we're going to do this. Now, what are we doing here? We're going to grab a pointer to the change button. Okay? Grabbing a pointer to the change button. Where is that button? That's the button that says change down here. And we're adding an event listener when this is clicked, all right? In other words, this used to be, in previous examples, would have an on click right on the HTML element. Here we're saying I want to add a listener. When it is clicked, call this method to change color. Do the same thing for the clear button. When the button is clicked, call this clear history method. So now it is just as though we have that on click method here and here. Specifics of the function are less important. The clear history is simply what we did in the previous example. It's going to go and look in that section called history over here, and it's going to loop through all the items in that element, all the elements in that HTML tag. See if there's any elements in there. If there is, remove the first one. And repeat that until there's no things left, no elements left. In other words, that history list section does not have a first child anymore. Let's see what change color does. Well, it sort of follows the same pattern we had before. We validate the form to see if we have valid stuff in there. We're not going to validate to make sure it's a legal color. That's on you. But we are going to validate to make sure that you put something in there. And we are going to validate to make sure that we don't put the same color in there. So the two have to be different because obviously you have the same foreground and background. You're not going to be able to see it. But if we have valid colors, then the form is valid, we can process it. If we put in junk for the color, doesn't do anything. All right. So I didn't bother to validate that that's a valid color. That'd be too extensive validation. All right. So first we validate that and we see, again, we grab. And again, here I use the inner HTML the same way because this is simple. I grab pointers to the air text. If there's nothing in the background string, I set the air text to must enter something. If there's nothing in the second one, I set the air text to must enter something. Finally, if the two things are equal, I'd say the two values must be different. In either case, I'm going to return either a true or false. All right, pretty standard, very similar to exercises I've done before. All right, now, once it's valid, what we're going to do is we're going to get the value from the background color. We're going to get the value from foreground color. We're going to set the changeable thing. That's this paragraph. Set that changeable thing to have the new foreground and background color. We're then going to create an LI element, just sort of like we did before. So that LI is floating in space. We formulate the text node inside that LI that says BG equals the background color, FG equals the foreground color. We append that text node to that LI node that is floating in space. So this creates the LI, this creates the text node. This adds the text node to the LI. This finds a history list and appends that new LI to the history list. The history list being this UL. So each time, if we have a valid form data, we create an LI, a text node, add the text node to the LI, and the LI to that UL. Now, as far as your assignment goes, your assignment, I would suggest that you try doing it using the create object method. All right. If you're really absolutely stuck on that, then use the inner HTML. But I would really prefer to you to use the create the object method. All right. Now, let's look at the assignment and let's try to identify where we've seen examples of this sort of stuff. So we're going to have a web page with a form on it. Radio buttons allows the users to choose between quarters, nickels, dimes, and pennies. A drop down that allows the user to pick 0 through 10 as a quantity. A button to initiate the JavaScript. And we're going to validate to make sure that the coin type and quantity were entered. All right. That is fairly straightforward. That is simply creating that form, creating a function to validate that form, associating the button with the function that validates and then processes the form. All right, we've done this in the last two examples. All right, The second example, having the preferred method of attaching the JavaScript to the HTML element, that is through JavaScript. Now, why, let's rewind a second. Why is it better to use JavaScript to attach it rather than using the HTML event? Again, we can get better separation between those two parts of code, and that leads to better reusability. For example, if we had something like tabs on many web pages, you know, like we did that in lab 2, I think, right? We had tabs. If we had something like that on many web pages, we could write a routine to go in when the page loads and add all the functionality for the tabs to everything that had a class that began with tab, or that had a class of tab, or something like that, right? We could loop through every element. We could find everything that had a class of tab and attach programmatically that on-click event to each item in turn, okay? Without touching the HTML, all right? Which means that I could come in to another totally different page and reuse the exact same JavaScript that would have an onload event, that would find everything with a class of tabs, and all I would have to do is maintain that convention of, if it's a tab, give it a class of tab. And I could just take and use that, reuse that section of Java code, put it in an external file, and reuse it on every page that had that kind of behavior. That's a real advantage of doing that. Again, it's very similar to why we separate CSS, all right? If there's no CSS mingled in with the HTML, then we could just take the style sheet, put it in an external file, and apply it to every page, and all the pages will have a consistent look. Same thing with the JavaScript. All right, when you press the button, calculate and display the value of the coin and quantity. So if they pick 3 and they pick dimes, it will show 30 cents. All right, that should be fairly straightforward. You're going to pull the value of the radio button. You're going to pull the value of the drop down. You already know it's valid, right? Because you validated it. So you don't have to worry about that. And you simply do the math and display it on the result on the page. So you have one result section that has the number in cents of that combination of coins. The harder part is this one. Display the number of copies of the image of the selected coin. So if they pick 3, display in the results area 3 dimes. I would have 2 result areas. One to display the total amount in cents, and one to display the images. Where have we seen code like this before? Well, in the first example that we looked at the very beginning of class, we dynamically created images and added them to somewhere on the page. We cleared them out first, and then we added them. The only difference is you're going to have to use a loop to loop through and execute some block of code multiple number of times. All right. I try to always do this. I try to make sure the connection is clear between the examples and the assignment. You know, I'm obviously not going to give something that duplicates an example, but I want to give very similar code so that you can take what you've learned in the examples and apply them to the assignment. Now, make your page look good. All right? Make your page look good. It doesn't have to look, it doesn't have to be like an award-winning design, but don't do a very bare bones page. Remember, I can get away with that because I'm not grading myself, all right? And I want the examples to be very clear, very obvious, so I don't do much with the styling of it because I'm not demonstrating CSS in this class. But take the time and use some CSS to make the page look Good. It should be valid HTML and valid CSS. How do you validate that? The W3C organization has an HTML validator where you can either upload your file or you can paste your code in here. And I can check to see if it's valid. Okay, and it tells me exactly what's wrong. All right, I should add a warning. I should add a lang attribute to the HTML tag. It looks like the only error is that I don't have a title tag in this example. And it's telling me that this trailing slash has no real effect and interacts badly with unquoted attribute values. Well, your values should always have quotes around them, but okay, fair enough. So the only thing it really found is a real problem is that I don't have a title tag. You can do the same thing with the CSS. How do I know that this is reliable? Well, the W3C org is the organization that creates the standards for web pages. So their validator better be as accurate as possible. And again, you can find a CSS validator also and do the same thing. Put your CSS code in and validate it. Are there any questions either about any of the examples I did today or the assignment? Yes.
The assignment is for the next week, isn't it?
Yeah, it's due next week. Yeah. I always try to have like a week after I've covered the material for you to actually do it then. So I try to have the lecture stay a little bit ahead so that, I'm not teaching you something today for an assignment that's due today. That really wouldn't be cool. So I'll teach you something the assignment's due next week.
Okay.
Now,
just because that you said it was week 3 and that was the last week, and we don't have any assignment for this week in this class.
That's correct.
I was quite wondering why it was like that.
Well, because this is a little bit bigger assignment.
Okay.
Yeah, the thought was this sort of counts as 2 assignments. So I lumped week 3 and 4 together, and I just made one big assignment for the both of them.
Okay.
Next week's going to be fun. All right, trust me on that. Well, it's going to be fun according to my definition of fun. All right. We're going to interact with some APIs, which is pretty cool. All right. If there's no questions, we'll either see you in lab or we will see you next week.